Are you somebody that's got a product idea and you want to develop some sort of tech application, but you might be non-technical, or you may have just not developed that many tech applications in your lifetime, and you want to understand exactly how you can go from idea to product in the most efficient, scalable, and cheapest way possible? In this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how this process works from start to finish in a really detailed way so that you're best equipped to be able to plan your project out properly, design it properly, and then develop it properly to ensure that it's scalable, it's done in the right way, and you lay the correct foundation for a hopefully really successful and profitable app later down the line. If you're wondering why you should be listening to me out of all people on how to build your tech product, if you're not familiar with the channel, I'll give you a real brief introduction into who I am. My name's Adam, I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and 4 or 5 years ago, I quit my job to become a freelance software developer on the world's largest global marketplace for talent called Upwork. Over the space of about 4 years, I completed over 50 projects for clients all over the world, developing all different kinds of software products in different industries. And in that time, I made a lot of mistakes, I learned a lot of things, and I'd really developed some clear processes on how to develop software applications efficiently, cheaply, and scalably. Using my experience as a freelancer, I then developed my own global software development agency called APG Software Solutions. And we've delivered over 60 projects for clients all over the world using this discover, design, and develop methodology, which applies to anybody building a tech product, no matter what tech stack you're using. I have conversations almost on a daily basis with entrepreneurs, startup founders, and all kinds of people looking to build apps. And I explain how this process works. And once you come out the other side, you understand the benefit of getting this right. But failure to build a solid foundation for your app could really leave you with some pretty serious tech debt and a lot of expensive scalability problems that you really just want to avoid if you understand this process properly. Now, without further ado, I'm going to jump in and explain how you go from your idea to what we call a discovery phase, which is really about documenting your idea and translating it into tech language. Then we design your product, then we develop your product, and then we build an MVP, which I'm going to define in more detail, and we define what the future stages for your MVP product are going to look like. Now, to get started, you've got an idea. Now, your idea is typically going to be an application, and it's very often in one of the following 3 categories, although it could be in something else. 90% of the software products that come through our door are either a marketplace, so they're trying to connect buyers and sellers in some sort of industry. It's a SaaS platform, which is a software as a service. So people pay some sort of money and they get some sort of value from your product. So there's a lot of SaaS platforms out there. The other option is some sort of internal tool or company tool like a CRM system or a CMS system or something like that. I'm going to quickly jot those down. So we've got internal tool, we've got SaaS, and we've got marketplace. Excuse my handwriting on that one. I know it's a little bit messy. Now, your idea could be something separate to this, but there's a good chance that it falls into one of those 3 categories. From there, we then have to enter our discover phase. Now, if you're building a tech product and you're technical, you may do this part yourself. If you're non-technical, I would highly recommend engaging with a freelancer, an agency, or somebody that is technical to help you translate your idea into a clear document, or a lot of people use Miro. We use FigJam to do this step to actually put what you want into tech language or into actual text that's easy to understand and which will help fuel a clear design file. Some of the things that you typically talk about in your discover phase. First off, we have tech stack. Now, what do I mean by tech stack? When you're building an application, it's going to be built on some sort of framework or system. Now, we typically build our products on low-code tech stack. So we use a tool called bubble.io, and I'll talk about the front end, the back end, the database, which are really the components of your tech stack at a later date. But a lot of people will use some sort of JavaScript framework like Vue or React for a front end. As for a database, you might use MongoDB, you might use products from Google or Amazon. There's a lot of different options there, and then you may have some sort of back-end language as well. It's important that you talk to a variety of different people when you're deciding your tech stack, because there are pros and cons to every single approach. And this is something that is quite difficult to change or modify later down the line. So you want to make sure you're very clear on the different options that you have with a tech stack and where you want to go with that. Now, I've got some other videos on why I think low-code tech stacks are a really good option, especially for startup founders and people looking to validate an idea in the market. But everyone you talk to is going to have a different idea on what a good tech stack is, and it's really important you do your research before you get started on where you'll be going with that one. Next up is a feature list. Now, before I talk about feature list, I'm going to quickly define what MVP actually means for people that aren't familiar. MVP stands for minimum viable product, and the idea of this is the absolute core product needed to solve your market problem. Now, what do I mean by that? A lot of founders get emotionally attached to their startup idea. They get really excited and they start to cram a whole list of features which they hypothesize that the users of their app might want. The issue with this is that hypothesizing or imagining what your users want is never as good as actually putting your application out into the market and letting real paying users tell you what they want. So the whole idea of an MVP is to basically scrap all of the bells and whistles and the fancy things on your product and to build the absolute bare bones skeleton of your project that works and solves the market problem. Now, it may not look as nice as you hope, it may not have some of the features that you think are really important, but it needs to, and in essence, do the absolute bare minimum to solve your market problem. The idea of this is that you can get a product to market for the cheapest possible amount and in the quickest time frame to validate that your application or your solution to a market problem is an actual real life solution. Then what you do is you listen to user feedback and you start to add all of the bells and whistles or the nice things to have if users request them in future stages of your MVP. So that's why I have future stages here. You can go ahead and add more integrations, add more features. Those all come after your MVP launch. So when I have MVP and future here on the future list, what features are absolutely core to solving your market problem and what features are really nice to have and we think the users will really appreciate them, but can come in future stages. Underneath that, we then have user roles. What do I mean by user roles? Well, let's take the example of an internal tool like a CRM software, which almost every company is running on. In that company software, you may have admins, you may have project managers, you may have employees, you may have salespeople, and they all have different user roles which define the rules that they have to look at in your database. So for example, certain sensitive financial data may only be available to project managers and company admins, and they don't want certain people to be looking at that information. So when we plan out what your database is going to look like and the data that your app's storing, we define certain privacy rules based on the user roles that you've defined in this stage. Now, in addition to that, we've got your branding. This one's fairly common sense, but this is things like fonts, colors, logos, all of those kind of things. We've got your pages. So pages could be things like you've got your static pages, which are typically your landing pages, about us, terms and conditions, privacy policy, blog, so on and so forth. And then you've got your actual application pages. So things like sign up, login or authentication. You might have a dashboard homepage. You might have a settings page. You might have a my profile page. You may have certain pages with lists of information. So that's really what we're trying to define there. Underneath that, we have competitor inspiration. And what do I mean by this? Essentially, we don't want to reinvent the wheel anywhere that we don't have to. So what I always recommend to clients that come to us is take a look in the current competitor landscape. There's probably someone out there that's doing something pretty similar to your app idea. And so what we recommend is go try their app out, find the things that you like about their app and find the things that you don't like about their app. And where they do things really well, let's use that as inspiration for our app to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel where we don't have to. The last thing there is the problem statement. Now, when we actually do our discovery file, this actually comes first. But basically, the problem statement and the problem overview and all that kind of information is essentially just some clear text on exactly what problem we're trying to solve with this app. So this is really in your application or business planning, I guess, but Yeah, that's the final thing, is detailed information on how to solve your problem. If you partner with some sort of reputable agency or freelancer who's done this a number of times already, they will do something that looks like this, but it may fall short in a couple of these areas. So if some of these things get missed out on, I'd highly recommend just asking them about it and documenting it so that you've got a really clear discover phase, or document, Miroboard, FigJam, wherever you do this. Because this is going to be the blueprint for your product build. So everything that you want in your app should be detailed in these categories. And I think if you do this well and you do this properly, it gives you something really solid to then move ahead and progress through your app's development. Now, once you've got this sorted, you're ready to move on to the next stage of building your MVP or your application. We call this phase the design phase, and essentially it's really prototyping your application. Now, why is this even necessary? And to be honest, is this just a waste of time? Can you skip it? My recommendation to this, after building over 60 applications, is any time that you invest in this phase, if you do it with someone who's doing it properly, will probably save you about 5 times that amount of time when you go to develop. So I think this is really worth investing time in. And essentially it should only really take 1 or 2 weeks maximum. Now, we use Figma to develop your prototype, and Figma is honestly the industry leader in this space. So I think it's by far the best tool to be prototyping your application on. And there's a number of benefits that exist to prototyping your application. The first one is you can demo this to investors and stakeholders. Now, especially people that are in startup accelerators, or you have investors and you want to keep them updated on exactly what you're doing. You might also have some mentors that are pretty interested in how this app's going to look and function. And so what this prototype does is essentially builds you a clickable example. It almost feels like a real app on exactly how this app's going to work. So you can click through the landing page buttons, click through the authentication, click through the dashboard, click through the settings pages, whatever's on your app. You can build yourself a clickable prototype that will outline the user flows, how it's going to look, how it's going to feel. And it almost feels like a real app, so that when you go to develop, you already know exactly what you're building. You can define with your developer or agency partner exactly how it's going to look, exactly how it's going to feel. And it's going to mean that there's going to be a lot less information lost in communication or translation, because everyone can see and really understand exactly what we're trying to build here. So underneath that is reduced dev time, which is really what I just mentioned, but you would be surprised how clear the idea is in your head. But you've got to remember that you're the expert in this field. You're the one that has this brilliant idea, but the developers probably have a very different idea in their head, and they're probably nowhere near as versed on your idea and your plans for this application. So failure to do this often means that you get features developed that you weren't even looking for. Things look and feel a whole lot different to what you had in your head, and you end up wasting all these hours developing things that you don't even want. So this is really important. And as I said before, I think you probably get 5 times as many hours that you spend prototyping reduced from development, because you get reduced errors, reduced mistakes, less back and forth between the agency and the client on exactly what's being built. And this is just a real win. In addition to that, you've got pre-launch marketing. So this is almost a demonstration of your app. And so if you want to possibly run some advertisements, we even had somebody go on a TV show and demo the application. It was actually a Figma file, but you can use this for basically demonstrating your application to potential users, building wait lists, all that kind of thing before your app's even launched. So whilst you're developing, you can really start to build some sort of marketing plan and start to build a waiting list for your application so that you can kind of hit the ground running as soon as you do launch. And the last thing is basically saving money. Now, a lot of people don't want to do a design file when you first mention it to them, because they think that it's just a waste of time. Maybe the agency's trying to get extra money out of me. I know exactly what I want. Why do I need to do this design file? Why can't we just jump straight into development? And that communication barrier between the tech team or the software team and the client it's famous for blowing out budgets, blowing out timelines, and once you come on the other side, you will realize the benefit of doing this design phase. But at the start, a lot of people who haven't built tech before get misled into thinking that this is a waste of time. In the comments, if you've built a tech product before, please help me explain to people that haven't built a tech product before that this phase is really important and really useful. Now, once you have that done, you are now ready to start developing. With the development, there's a number of different features in your application that I'm going to make you aware of so that you understand, at least to a degree, what your tech team's actually doing. One of the most frustrating things that I see for founders who are non-technical is a bit of a misunderstanding on exactly what the tech team's doing and why things are taking so long, and sometimes why certain buttons on the app suddenly break or all sorts of things suddenly change. People who aren't familiar with tech seem to think that the entire house or the entire app might be falling down, when really it's just a minor change in the database or something like that that's caused that error. So to give you a quick course on what an application actually is, it really compiles of 4 major things. You've got your front end, your back end, your database, and your third-party integrations. Now, I'm skipping over a couple things that are more minor, but I think an understanding of at least what these 4 things are will much better equip you to communicate with your tech team and be able to understand what's actually happening. Your front end is essentially everything you see and your pages. So in really basic terms, it's the way your pages look, the buttons, the buttons that take you to different pages, and the buttons that kind of perform actions on your page. Next up, you've got your backend or your server. And this is where mainly operations on your data happen. And so if you're, for example, running operations on lists of data, or you might be making secure API requests, and you know, I know that's technical, but we'll touch on that later. That tends to happen in your backend. Your database is where all your data is stored. And this typically looks, if you're building in a SQL database, it typically just looks like a lot of Excel sheets that are all kind of interconnected to each other. So it's called a relational database if you're building that kind of application. And then third-party integrations are API services that you might be connecting with. So some really common third-party integrations are some sort of AI integration that could be with OpenAI or some other LLM. Stripe is a really common one for payments processing. Common accounting ones are Xero, Qubio, Myob. And you've really got a whole list of third-party services that you could integrate with depending on your application. So we connect to different services via an API, and that's what that dot point is really talking about. So a basic understanding in your application, you've got front end, everything you look and see, back end, where scheduled workflows run and operations in your data tend to run, database, which is where all your data is stored, and third-party integrations, which is where your app connects to other applications. Why is this important? Because when you communicate with your team, you can understand exactly what's happening and where problems are in each of these places. And what I'll quickly touch on is the more complexity that you introduce in each of these 4 areas, the longer it's going to take to build your product and probably the more expensive it's going to be. Now, from our experience, when we quote out a project, the things that we look at that tend to drive your prices up are how many third-party integrations are you working with? The reason for that is to connect to other services. Not only do we have to set up those API connections, we also have to get familiar with the API that third party exposes. And then there's all sorts of issues that could happen from their side that we need to take into account. So certain data might come in formats that don't work that well with your application, or there might be server issues on there that, all sorts of errors returned by that API that we need to manually handle and display appropriately to the user. And so it takes a little bit of time to set those things up often, and it can tend to drive your prices up. Front-end stuff tends to be a bit cheaper. It's usually design changes, copy changes, navigation changes. This, I wouldn't focus too much on in your MVP. Design changes, at least for us, are probably the easiest change out of these 4. And so what we try and focus on for our MVP launch is getting the functionality of your app, which is mostly back-end database and third-party integrations, done first, and then we can change design pretty quickly and easily and whenever you want. So we really want to deliver functionality first, make it look pretty second. Just to round this off, the tech stack that you choose is going to really affect how these things are set up. So if we use a low-code framework called Bubble, and your front end, your back end, and your database are actually all in the same place. So it's really easy to manage in comparison to some of the traditional tech stacks that are out there. And DevOps and maintaining your application are pretty quick and pretty cheap in a lot of cases. If you use some traditional tech stacks, your front end might be on one framework, your back end might be on another framework, your database is with some sort of database provider, and then you set up your API integrations, typically with either your front end or your back end, but you may need to hire more than one developer to build each of these things. You might have a front end developer working on your front end, a back end developer working on your database and your back end, and maybe an even larger team if required. Down the bottom here, we've got two things that are really important for people to keep in mind for this develop phase. First one is piloting and testing. Now, software has bugs. That doesn't mean that we don't try to build your software products with as minimum or as few bugs as possible, but every time you make a change, I would think of software as a house of cards. Now, if software is built properly, you want to ideally have as few cards in those base layers as possible, so that when you make a little change, you want it to have as few knock-on effects to other parts of your application as possible. But in nature, they do have knock-on effects. So sometimes making small changes to things in your database or small changes to things in your application can break other things that you wouldn't expect. So this piloting and testing phase is really important. And some people have misleading expectations on how well an application should flow in an MVP. Now, it really depends on your complexity, but the other reason we try and keep it lean is because the more you try and stuff into this develop phase, the more features, the more moving pieces that we have to connect together to work perfectly on MVP launch. And so the longer it takes to develop it, the more complex it's going to be and the more expensive it's going to be. The leaner you build this MVP, the less moving pieces we have to connect together to get your product to launch. And in turn, what we can do is we can get you a nice stable product for launch, and then we can slowly phase your other features on with a proper testing and deployment process in place to try and minimize the number of bugs and issues that you have in your app. And so that's why I've written core product here. It's important to remember that this is not the be all and end all for your application. This is the very first thing that users are using. Some people get caught up thinking that this MVP is their final product. It needs to be absolutely perfect. All the colors need to be, amazing. We need to make a million iterations before we deploy this. My philosophy is try and solve, does your product solve a problem? Now, it may be missing a few bells and whistles. There may be a few issues, but just get it out there. That's my advice. As long as it's built pretty well, trying to wait until something is absolutely perfect to launch is going to mean you're waiting extra weeks and months to get something out there, when that real user feedback that we can get by deploying your product is probably going to help you solve and possibly even change some of the things that you're waiting on to deploy for your MVP. So my advice, get a quality product, build it quickly, throw it out to the market, get the user feedback, iterate, keep growing. Now, if you've done all this properly and successfully, you should be ready to launch your MVP. And the first thing you should do is give yourself a pat on the back, because you would be surprised how many people get stuck in this stage of an app development and never even make it to here. So if you've made it to here and you have an MVP, congratulations, you're ahead of a lot of other people. But it's definitely not the end of the road. You'll probably push it to market and you'll find that you get all sorts of user feedback. There could be a couple bugs in your application, all those kind of things. And this is where future stages come into play. So you need to have some sort of agile setup with your development team so that you can define the priority of new features and bug fixes that need to be pushed out when your application's live. And you can set up an efficient process that allows you to quickly iterate, make improvements, fix bugs, and deliver what your users want at the end of the day. To summarize this all really quickly, we've got an idea, somebody with a really bright idea to solve a problem in a market. Ideally, they talk with somebody technical if that person isn't them, and they develop a clear blueprint that covers all of these things. This blueprint is then used to develop a working prototype of your application. This working prototype is then used to develop an application, ideally a lot quicker and a lot cheaper, because we now have a solid foundation and solid documentation on exactly how this app is going to look, work and feel, and what features it contains. Once we've developed that core product, we then deploy it to live as our MVP, and we try our best to onboard some real paying users. Using the extremely valuable feedback that we get from these paying users, we iterate on the product, we try and get a stable product out there that solves the problem, and then we stage all of the future feature improvements or requests from these users to further develop your product into priorities, and we deploy those systematically as we further develop your product. Now, I hope you found this overview useful. I know I spent a lot of time talking, but really understanding this process, I think, is going to be the best equipment for you to develop an actual successful and scalable tech product, because I've built a lot of these tech products. I know how hard it is to get out there and actually build something that people want for a reasonable budget and not hit all of the roadblocks and all the issues that are so common in the tech landscape. The other thing is, if you are a non-technical founder, if you understand these things and appreciate these things, it's going to make the communication and the understanding between you and your tech partner a whole lot easier, because you actually understand how things are working. And it might also give you some grounds to kind of ask good questions to your tech team and maybe even point them in the right direction if they've skipped over a couple small things in these steps. It's really going to help you build a successful product. So I hope you found this useful. If you think that I might have missed something in here, or you want to offer some feedback on anything in these lists, feel free to definitely let me know down in the comments. If you're interested in building technology, especially with low code and AI, feel free to join my completely free community where I discuss all things from freelancing and agency management to no code and AI and automation. So if you're interested in that, the link will be in the description below. If you found this video useful at all, please consider subscribing to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.